Hi everybody, this is Matt, and I've got a very special announcement for you. We here at the No Fear Cast were lucky enough to get to do an interview with the writer Ruth Franklin, who is author of the Shirley Jackson biography, A Rather Haunted Life. So please be sure to check this out. It will be available on January 3rd. Thanks.
There must be something ghostly in the air of Christmas, something about the close, muggy atmosphere that draws up the ghosts. Like the dampness of the summer rains brings out the frogs and snails. And not only do the ghosts themselves always walk on Christmas Eve, but live people always sit and talk about them on Christmas Eve. Whenever 5 or 6 English-speaking people meet round a fire on Christmas Eve, they start telling each other ghost stories. Nothing satisfies us on Christmas Eve but to hear each other tell authentic anecdotes about specters. It is a genial festive season, and we love to muse upon graves and dead bodies and murders and blood.
Hi, I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Podcast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. Today is our special Christmas episode. So this is going to drop on December 20th, so let's go ahead and say Merry Christmas now. We have a special guest co-host with us who is a Dickens expert, a Charles Dickens expert, Sherry, and we will be talking with her about A Christmas Carol and other Dickensian Christmas stories. First off, I just want to tell where the quotation was that we used for the introduction to this episode. It was from the introduction to Jerome K. Jerome's short story collection, Told After Supper, which was published in 1891. And I highly recommend it because it's basically a very funny parody of Victorian ghost stories. So in the 1890s, there had already been a spate of these things published. And he basically has, I think it's 5 or 6 stories where he makes fun of a trope from Victorian ghost stories in each one. And it's very entertaining. With that, let's go ahead and get into just talking about why telling ghost stories on Christmas. Lisa, what do you think? Why do you think that we would have this tradition, particularly in the Victorian time period, but even in horror since then, of ghost stories and horror not just being a Halloween thing, but also maybe a Christmassy or midwinter thing as well?
You know, it's interesting. When we were thinking about this topic, and I was doing some initial research for this episode, I got a little upset that this isn't a Christmas tradition today. You know, I thought, why did the Victorians get to have all the fun? Because it is, as you said, a very Victorian idea of this Christmas ghost story. And it does make sense because they had their friends and family gathered together, and I can just imagine that they're all sitting there. They've had a big dinner. They're all sitting around the fire. Of course, it's cold, it's dark, it's December. You know, let's be honest, they didn't have too much to do back then as far as entertainment. But, you know, I can see how it would very easily shift into, well, let's tell each other stories. Well, let's tell each other spooky ghost stories. But then the more I started thinking about this, you know, this is something that does cross over into today. I mean, we certainly still see Christmas-themed horror movies. There's plenty out there if you want to find them. But even in things like, you know, the movie Gremlins from my childhood was set at Christmas, and there was a spooky Christmas story about a dad getting stuck in a chimney. So it does seem that it's something that still lingers today, even if it's not as common as it was there in the Victorian times. And I guess this is just a roundabout way of saying, I don't know. I don't know what it is about specifically the Christmas season that makes us gravitate towards these darker tales. I don't know.
Well, when I was thinking about this topic, I was thinking just about how cold it is around Christmas and how we're in our longest nights. You know, we have the shortest day around that time. And there just seems to be, I don't know, it's almost like, I think we talked about this on the bonus Halloween episode, this idea that fall starts that time that seems like the line between the living and the dead is thinner than ever before. And I think maybe getting into that wintry time, which is so often associated with death, literally, because, if you're in a really cold climate, you don't want to be stuck outside, or you don't want to be homeless if you're living in a city in a cold climate. But yeah, it's just this kind of dark time of the year where you're thinking, it's a holiday, so you're thinking of people who've gone before. It would maybe prompt you to remember people that you've lost. And I know one of the things I was reading for this episode talked about how the idea of stories built around what are called crisis apparitions were really big. So a story that was built upon a visitation by an actual dead family member, either at the moment that they die or someone that you have a very tight bond with. And if you think about it too, another one that's a more contemporary work would be The Shining, which takes place in the middle of winter when you have the snow and the isolation and the cold. But particularly in the Victorian time period, you've got the rise of the publication industry. You've got more folks reading probably than ever before. And so this very communal time of everybody being together and remembering past times and telling stories, or maybe even trying to scare each other because, you maybe don't have electricity or other entertainment, seem to kind of become commercialized in a way. It becomes this publication phenomenon. As an Americanist, I immediately think of Henry James' The Turn of the Screw, published in 1898, which starts out as just a bunch of people in an old house in the country telling ghost stories to each other. And the one guy says, I've got the best one, and then The Turn of the Screw gets told. So it seems like there's just a lot of just natural human tendency to tell scary stories in that time of year, mixed up with also from the 19th century forward these kind of commercial aspects of publishing. I don't know, Sherry, what do you think? What would you like to add to that?
Yeah, talking about A Christmas Carol, it's kind of the quintessential Christmas ghost story, and I think that we tend to forget the subtitle of that is A Ghost Story for Christmas, that it was written as a ghost story because it has such a sentimental reputation now as a Christmas piece. And I think we tend to forget, too, that Dickens was as much a horror writer as a sentimentalist. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about his connections with horror fiction first, and then I thought we could talk about A Christmas Carol itself. He had a lifelong interest in ghost stories, and you're talking about some of these ghost stories that were published at Christmas for Victorian readers. He wrote a lot of standalone ghost stories, some of them like his story Captain Murderer, that's about a kind of Bluebeard character who murdered his wives and baked them into meat pies, were based on bedtime stories that his nurse told him as a child. And if you think about his novels, Gothic motifs, horror motifs appear in almost all of his novels. Even going back to the first novel, The Pickwick Papers, that one is full of interpolated ghost tales. In fact, one of them is called The Story of the Goblins Who Stole a Sexton, is usually regarded as an early version of A Christmas Carol. It's about a gravedigger who refuses to celebrate Christmas, and he's kidnapped by goblins who then show him visions that end up reforming him. And there are also several tales in Pickwick Papers that are really similar in style to Edgar Allan Poe's stories. There's one called The Madman's Manuscript that is a first-person confession by a madman who is haunted by the ghost of the wife that he murdered. And a lot of your listeners may not be aware that Dickens actually had a powerful impact on Edgar Allan Poe. Poe was a big admirer of Dickens. And in fact, the year before Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol, he went on a tour of the United States, and Poe sought him out, and the two men met. And while we don't have a record of what they talked about when they met, we do know that Dickens was in part an inspiration for Poe's poem The Raven. Scholars think that Poe's Raven was based in part on a pet raven, an actual pet raven that Dickens owned, a talking raven named Grip, that he had transformed into a character in one of his novels, Barnaby Rudge, that was a novel that Edgar Allan Poe admired. And so Grip was an inspiration for Poe's Raven. And when the real Grip died, Dickens had a taxidermist stuff him, preserve the bird's corpse, and it was later donated to the Philadelphia Free Library, where Grip is now on display alongside the original manuscript of Poe's The Raven. So there's these weird connections between Dickens and horror literature and beyond A Christmas Carol. And in fact, you mentioned like Stephen Stephen King's The Shining, many great contemporary horror writers like Stephen King and Anne Rice have cited him as a major influence on their fiction.
You know, Sherry, when you're talking about all that, I mean, first of all, I like to think that I know a lot about Edgar Allan Poe, and I was not even aware of especially that connection to the Raven to Dickens at all. So that really surprises me and kind of delights me. But when he was writing A Christmas Carol, I was wondering what other inspirations he had for that beyond, I guess, the literature of the day.
Well, especially, he was a great writer of the social novel of the Victorian period. So I think that his fondness for horror fiction, combining with the long tradition of telling ghost stories at Christmas, caused him to turn to the Christmas ghost story as a means of expressing his horror at the social conditions of Victorian England, the real problem of poverty. And here's where we get into the historical context of the novella actually giving the foundation of its horror. It was written in 1843 during the decade that's now known as the Hungry 40s, when the social and economic turmoil of the Industrial Revolution reached its height in England, and you had the middle classes ascending into greater and greater wealth and power, while the lower classes were falling deeper and deeper into poverty, to the point where starvation became a literal reality for many in the working classes. And Dickens was particularly concerned with the impact of poverty on working class children because, of course, orphaned paupers tend to be the protagonists of much of his fiction. But I think that's because their conditions evoked memories of his own horrific experience as a child laborer. And here's where I think we have to remember that A Christmas Carol is also a story about the ghostly resurrection of childhood memories of childhood trauma, because, with the Ghost of Christmas Past, you have Scrooge remembering the trauma of his own childhood neglect, and that is based in Dickens' own biography. Even though he was born into the middle classes, when he was 12 years old, his father went bankrupt and was put into debtor's prison. And Dickens basically had to support himself as the oldest male child in the family. He had to go to work and was sent to work in a blacking factory, a factory where they made shoe polish. And he had to work 10-hour days in horrific working conditions without access to education, live by himself, support himself entirely on his barely subsistence wage, so that he often went hungry. And even though his family was eventually able to recover enough of their finances to take him out of that situation and send him to a middle-class school, most biographers see that childhood trauma as the foundation for his tremendous empathy that he had for the poor, especially for poor children, and also the foundation of the tremendous terror, lifelong terror that he had of poverty for himself. It was a fear that continued to haunt him throughout his life, even when he was most successful. So that terror of poverty, I think, is at the heart of A Christmas Carol. And you asked about other inspirations for the novella. There were actually 3 things that happened right before he wrote it that are based in that fear of poverty and want that sparked the writing of it. First was the publication in early 1843 of a report by the British Parliament revealing findings of an investigation they did into the problem of child labor. And it contained appalling stories about the working and living conditions of working class children, and Dickens read that. And then just a month before he began writing A Christmas Carol, he witnessed these conditions himself when he made a visit to one of London's ragged schools. These were schools that were set up by wealthy philanthropists, similar to, you remember those guys that approached Scrooge at the beginning of A Christmas Carol to try to get him to give to the poor. Similar to that, people that set up schools to give rudimentary education to working class children. And Dickens, who did a lot of philanthropic work himself, visited one of these schools and was just horrified by the living conditions of the children that he saw attending this school. And so what he initially wanted to do was write a political pamphlet to wake his readers up to what he called the plight of the working man's child. That he wanted it to have what he called a sledgehammer effect on his audience. But instead of writing a political pamphlet, luckily for us, he chose to write a piece of fiction instead. And that brings us to the last inspiration for writing A Christmas Carol, his own terrible fear of impending poverty. He needed to make money in 1843, even though he was at that time the most popular novelist in the world. His family was growing by leaps and bounds. He ended up having eventually 10 children. He was falling deeper and deeper into debt, and the monthly issues of the novel that he was writing then were not selling as well as his past fiction, and he needed something that he could produce quickly that could make money fast. And so he thought of writing the short Christmas novella. And the great irony of that is that it's the novella that exposes the terrible social effects of greed and materialism of industrial capitalism, but it's also a commercial venture that he produced out of his own desperate need for money. So it had both the philanthropic and commercial aspirations. But that terror of poverty is at the core, I think, of the story's horror.
Well, and that also connects to the fact that he was writing a lot of Christmas stories and even getting other people to write Christmas stories for his own periodicals, right, to continue publishing.
Yeah, the periodicals would actually come later in the 1850s, ghost stories for periodicals, because in the 1840s he focused on publishing Christmas books. With the great success of Christmas Carol in 1843, he published 4 more Christmas novellas, short novels, that all focused around the conversion of a stingy character or a cynical character by, most of them by supernatural intervention of some kind of spirits. But when he got into the 1850s, it got too difficult for him to produce an annual Christmas novella, and that's when he turned to producing special Christmas issues of the magazines that he was editing, first Household Words and then All the Year Round. And he would invite prominent Victorian authors to contribute ghost stories to those special issues of those magazines. So you had writers like Wilkie Collins, who was one of the great mystery writers of the period. In fact, he's credited with writing the first detective novel in the English language, The Moonstone. And he was a big collaborator of Dickens on some of his ghost stories. And also Elizabeth Gaskell, another Victorian novelist, contributed several short stories to those special Christmas issues of his magazine. In fact, maybe the most famous issue was the 1859 issue of Household Words that was called The Haunted House, and it featured a frame narrative by Dickens about a haunted house that several friends got together to visit in order to investigate its haunting. It's reportedly haunted, and he got several writers like Gaskell and Wilkie Collins to contribute stories to this description of the haunted house, and each friend that is visiting the house tells their own story about their experience with its haunting. But those stories are kind of unique because each of the stories provides ultimately a rational explanation for the haunting. So they ultimately debunk the haunting. And that particular issue, I think, of that magazine was inspired by Dickens' own skepticism about spiritualism. Spiritualism by the 1850s had become a really popular movement in Victorian England, and he really didn't believe in the concept of mediums contacting people after death, etc. And so we have these skeptical, actually anti-ghost stories. But if you want a wonderful standalone ghost story that gives no rational explanation for the haunting that occurs in it, that was published in one of his special Christmas editions of his magazine, All the Year Round, there's a ghost story that most scholars consider really his best ghost story, produced in 1866, is called The Signal Man. And it's about a railway signal man, guy who works on the railroad, who's in charge of maintaining the safety of the trains that run through his station by signaling any dangers that lie ahead on the tracks. And in this story, the signal man has been witnessing apparitions of a specter appearing on the train tracks that seems to appear just prior to terrible train accidents. So it appears as a kind of premonition of an upcoming accident. And while that concept is terrifying in itself, what's really spooky to me about this story is its connection with Dickens' own life and death. He wrote it, I said, in 1866, and in 1865, he was one of the few survivors of a really terrible train wreck, the Staplehurst train tragedy, when a train he was traveling on derailed over a gorge, and he was in one of the cars that was hanging off of the bridge into the gorge, and he was able to escape. He climbed out of the wreckage and was able to escape unharmed, but he stayed at the accident site to help care for the wounded and the dying. And for the remainder of his life, he continued to suffer his own visitations of that trauma. He was haunted by that trauma and suffered symptoms of what we today would probably call post-traumatic stress. And in fact, he died of a stroke on the 5th anniversary of that accident. So you just think of that when you read that story, The Signalman. The train for him was this image of the rampaging horror of industrialization, leaving mutilation and death in its wake. So that's a particularly spooky one. I mean, if you want to think about him as a Christmas sentimentalist, we tend to think of him as this happy Father Christmas figure. We got to remember that also he was a writer of horror fiction as well.
Well, and I feel like that horror comes out, in his Christmas writing. I mean, one of the stories that I read over the past week, getting ready for this, was The Haunted Man and the Ghost Bargain. And I just found it terrified that the guy is basically haunted by himself and makes a decision, to forget all these horrible traumas that he's experienced. But of course, that messes him up because that makes him who he is. And you think of even Christmas Carol with the kind of horrors of poverty that he shows, and even the ghosts themselves. I mean, they're not, the ghosts of Christmas Yet to Come is not nice. There's a kind of a horror that's a flip side to the sentimental aspect, or maybe the horror is pushing us to be sentimental, I'm not sure. But yeah, I mean, you want to talk more about that kind of haunting aspect, gothic aspect of the Christmas Carol?
Yeah, I think that part of that, oddly enough, is connected to the figure of the child, the Christmas child. And of course, we mentioned children, pauper children, are really important throughout his fiction as these representations of his own horrific experience of poverty as a kid. But when you think of A Christmas Carol, the Christmas child that we tend to think of most is Tiny Tim, the sentimental face of the horrors of poverty in that novella. But for me, the really horrific characters are the little children that are the phantoms of ignorance and want. And you mentioned the ghost of Christmas Yet to Come. He's led into by the ghost of Christmas Present, who presents these little phantoms of ignorance and want to Scrooge as the last vision that he presents to Scrooge before he disappears, and we have the advent of the ghost of Christmas Yet to Come. And he shows him these phantoms, and they're described in the novella as wolfish, monstrous children, animalistic, terrifyingly dangerous. And the ghost shows them with this apocalyptic warning, not only to Scrooge, but I think to Dickens' audience. He tells them, these are your children. These are your children. See, look at them. If you don't see them, if you don't recognize their suffering, and you think about apparitions and hauntings and the effect that they have on us seeing things, and if you don't see them, if you don't recognize what they're going through, then this is the future of all of humanity. And then as they disappear, the ghost of Christmas Yet to Come in the form of the horrifying Grim Reaper appears in their place. And that, to me, is the most terrifying moment in that novella that I think would have had the sledgehammer effect on Dickens' Victorian readers that he wanted. I don't know. What do the rest of you guys think? If you're viewing this as a piece of horror fiction, are there really scary moments in the novella for you?
Well, those moments are scary for me. I completely agree with you, Sherry, when you're talking about it. But even more so, I think now, because I think like most of our listeners, I was introduced to the Christmas Carol when I was much younger, and it was a much more sanitized version than what Dickens originally intended. It was a very, sentimental portrait of Christmas. In fact, I'm pretty sure that maybe the first version I ever saw was an animated one with Mickey Mouse, And now the children, ignorance and want are absolutely terrifying from a horror standpoint, but also just maybe from an adult perspective looking at it, Tiny Tim is terrifying to me. If nothing else, the fact that we present him today as this innocent child at Christmas who just, he just wants his family to be happy. And when you think about what Tiny Tim is actually representing, and these true horrors of children in poverty and children who had to deal with absolutely horrendous work environments, it changes your whole view of that character, I think. And I don't know, the whole thing just kind of makes me shudder now thinking about it.
Yeah, I think about Tiny Tim when I first read the novella. I wasn't very impressed with him because I was more accustomed to, I was introduced to the story through the film adaptations too, and through the ones that are geared towards children, like the Mickey Mouse Carol. And Tiny Tim tends to come across as a character with more entertainment substance in those adaptations. And when I read the novella, he didn't have the same substance of personality, complex personality of some of Dickens' later child creations like David Copperfield and Pip from Great Expectations. He seemed kind of saccharine to me, but when he's placed in opposition to ignorance and want, and I think you're right when you think of him in the historical context of the horrors of Victorian poverty, he does assume a new level of horror because he dies in the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come's vision. He is dead, and the dead body is sitting above the room in which the Cratchits family is gathered by the hearth. And so hovering over that warm image of the family at hearth is the image of not just death, but child death. And I think he reminds us that even a child who had the love of a family to support him, when they're the victim of poverty, there's terrible risk to that kind of child. So it's not just the neglected children represented by ignorance and want, and young Scrooge himself who's neglected by his parents and becomes the monster that he becomes, who are in danger, but even the children who have loving support if people don't pay attention to the horrors of their suffering. And so, yeah, I think you've made me take a new look at him, I think, in the text of the novella itself, that if you put him a kind of his bookend with the phantoms of ignorance and want, he takes on an even more deep importance beyond the sentimentality of the suffering child victim.
Well, I think this idea of the impoverished child, or maybe even the neglected child, isn't at all unfamiliar to readers of Dickens. I mean, this is something that pops up throughout his works, right, Sherry?
Yeah, in fact, in his later novels, the neglected child or the pauper child takes on even more horrific connections with Christmas. In his later novel, whereas in his early fiction, like in A Christmas Carol, Christmas seemed to symbolize this potential to rectify social ills through those values of community, compassion, domesticity that were evoked by Christmas. In his later novels, as his social vision got darker, as he saw his society was not changing in the way he had hoped to bring about this kind of moral revolution with works like A Christmas Carol, but the same social problems were continuing, I think Christmas started, and the pauper child started to signify the failure of values of charity, personal benevolence against this overwhelming social corruption. And so in later novels, you get these kids connected with Christmas who end up often being corrupted or destroyed by that connection. And I think about the opening of Great Expectations in particular, the opening chapters of that novel. The first chapter is set on Christmas Eve, and you have the little pauper child, Pip. The novel opens in a graveyard, the little pauper child Pip visiting the graves of his parents, and he is attacked by an escaped convict who pops up from among the graves like a ghost, is the analogy that's used. And that event sets in motion this entire series of ghostly events, like his introduction to Miss Havisham's haunted house, and these series of events that end up corrupting him as he rises in wealth and in society. He begins to be more and more dehumanized. So Christmas begins to take on these darker connotations, especially in the later works. And if any of you are thinking about dysfunctional Christmas family dinners, if you suffered through dysfunctional Christmas family dinners, you need to read the chapter in Early Great Expectations. I think it's maybe chapter 4, where Pip is having Christmas dinner with his horrible sister who has adopted him. And boy, that's a dysfunctional family Christmas, where they use the Christmas dinner as an opportunity to torture the poor child that they don't want to be responsible for and that they don't want to take care of.
Okay, interesting. I was just thinking, isn't the last novel he wrote, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, set at Christmas too?
Yeah, that one I think is particularly terrifying. That may be the most terrifying use of Christmas ever, because it's a mystery novel that he wrote. His last novel, he died while writing it, and it remains unsolved. And it's set in the Christmas season. It's about the disappearance of a young man named Edwin Drood on Christmas Eve, following a violent altercation at a Christmas party, and it's believed that Edwin has been murdered. And as I said, Dickens died while writing the novel, leaving it unfinished, and he did not leave in his notes or anything any specific solution to the mystery. But most scholars believe that Edwin was murdered by the horrifying central character of that novel, Edwin's own uncle, a character named John Jasper. And this is where it gets really creepy. John Jasper is a choir master at the local cathedral. He's kind of the closest to a split personality that you can get. By day, he's a respectable churchman who is working with the choir in a country town, and by night he's a raving lunatic opium addict who races up to London at night to hang out in the opium dens, where he lives out his darkest fantasies, most violent fantasies, while in opium-induced trances. And the novel implies that his favorite recurring fantasy is the fantasy of murdering his beloved nephew Edwin and raping Edwin's fiancée, the young girl that John Jasper lusts after. So it is an absolutely terrifying depiction of Victorian repression. In fact, some scholars argue that if Dickens had lived to finish it, Robert Louis Stevenson wouldn't have written Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because Dickens would have been there, done that.
Sherry, when you're talking about Drood, which has always been a source of fascination for me, I don't know if it was because it's his last novel or because it was unfinished and we'll never really know the ending of it. But I'm just wondering, you're talking about the disappearance of this young man, and you're talking about the kind of, for lack of a better word, the Jekyll and Hyde aspect of this uncle. But what I'm wondering is why he decided to set it at Christmas, because from what you've told me, and it's been a while since I've read anything to do with Drood, but it sounds like the plot could have been set really at any time of the year, and I'm wondering why specifically he chose Christmas for that. Is it just because it was tradition at the time to kind of tell these horror stories at Christmas, or is there something deeper behind that he wanted to use the story of Edwin Drood's disappearance to highlight about the particular season?
So I think part of it is that tradition of combining ghost stories and stories of horror and murder with that particular season, but also Christmas had such a thematic importance for him throughout his work. So many of his narratives are set at Christmas time or make reference to the Christmas season, not just his Christmas books. So we have novels like Edwin Drood or Great Expectations. They're also set at Christmas. And I think these later novels like Drood and Great Expectations reflect a kind of disillusionment with what Christmas symbolized for him as he got later and later in his life and began to realize that many of the social issues that he was trying to rectify through his fiction were not being changed, and that the personal benevolence that he that he promoted as a solution, like Scrooge being redeemed, transformed into this philanthropist, and he goes and gives money to Tiny Tim's family, and he saves Tiny Tim from death, and he gives a raise to Bob Cratchit. That kind of thing might save the Cratchit family, but how is that going to work on an entire social basis, that things aren't being rectified and settled, to where outcomes at Christmas of bad things that happen at Christmas in his later fiction do not have good outcomes. We don't have those moments of redemption and happiness and family togetherness in those novels. In fact, we have the opposite, the fractured family, the completely destroyed family, with the beloved uncle turning against his own nephew and possibly murdering him. And in part, too, the Edwin Drood novel, and this is where it gets really scary if you think about Dickens' biography connecting to his depictions of Christmas and abused children, is that there are a lot of biographers that feel that the villain, John Jasper, in that novel, Edwin Drood, is in part an expression of Dickens' own divided personality, because at the end of his life, he was leading an increasingly double life as the public Father Christmas figure, hearty, happy Father Christmas figure that we tend to associate him with today, as a representative of values of domesticity and Christmas cheer and happiness. That was his public persona with his readers, but privately, his family had fallen apart. He had been separated from his wife and taken his 10 children away from her, and that was because we now know that he was engaging in an extramarital affair with the young actress that he was hiding from his public. If that had been found out, it would have probably been the end of his reputation and his writing career. So he was actually living under assumed name part of the time with this young woman, a 17-year-old actress, while he was writing these final novels. And so in part, I think that division that you see in a character like John Jasper, who commits a terrible crime at Christmas time and violates all the values of Christmas, comes from repressed guilt and horror of Dickens' own divided experience, his own divided lifestyle that he was leading at the end of his life. So he's not just that happy Father Christmas figure. He's deeply connected with the darkness of the human spirit, and he's had, like I said before, powerful impact on other horror writers like Edgar Allan Poe, Stephen King, Anne Rice, etc.
It really is going to make me think twice when somebody starts talking about a Dickens Christmas this month.
Yeah, Dickens is credited, with inventing Christmas, or at least his Christmas novellas like Christmas Carol kind of constructed that image of the happy Victorian Christmas and family Christmas that we now associate with him today. But there were a lot of darker elements of the season that, like you pointed out, the tradition of ghost stories that in part arise out of that tradition of telling ghost stories in the season, and it also come out of his own fondness for horror and some of the horrors that he lived through as a person.
So instead of reading Christmas Carol every year, maybe people should read Edwin Drood.
Yeah, one of the fun things about Edwin Drood, too, is trying to actually find the little clues to the solution to the mystery throughout the text of the novel that exists. And there have been there's a whole industry around trying to solve that mystery, because there are many people who don't buy the idea that the John Jasper character is the actual murderer. So that's fun in and of itself. But yeah, it is a really creepy piece of fiction. If we recommend some adaptations to your listeners, this may be weird, but of the many, many film adaptations of Christmas Carol that are so great, and many of them tend to focus on the sentimental aspects of the novella, like Mickey's Christmas Carol, the Disney adaptation that Lisa mentioned. There's also a recent Disney adaptation starring Jim Carrey there was an animated adaptation they did a few years ago with Jim Carrey playing Scrooge and all of the Christmas ghosts. And this one has become one of my favorites because it really recaptures the horror of the original novella. It's animated with motion capture technology. If you know what I'm talking about, that's where they film a live version first and then they animate over it. And while I think that technology is wonderful for visualizing non-human characters like the ghosts, or think about the character of Gollum from the Lord of the Rings movies that was filmed with motion capture technology. Truthfully, I'm not real fond of this technology when it's used to animate human characters because it tends to give them this dead-eyed, zombified look. But it's very appropriate in this particular adaptation because it focuses on the horror of the novel. And again, I think the best scene is the scene where Ghost the Christmas Present presents the little spirits of ignorance and want, the phantoms of ignorance and want to Scrooge. And the way it's set up in that film is that the ghost is presenting them as the clock is striking midnight on Christmas, his last moments on earth. And with each stroke of the clock, the ghost decays into this terrifying, shrieking, maniacal skeleton, laughing maniacally, while with each stroke, the children, ignorance and want, mature into these horrific adults, a murderous pickpocket and a prostitute who end up attacking Scrooge. And then with the final stroke of midnight, they all disappear, and Scrooge's own shadow transforms into the ghost of Christmas yet to come. It's fantastically horrific visuals, and I show that scene when I teach a Christmas Carol. I show that scene to my students to remind them that it is a horror story.
That sounds horrifying. Okay, well, still on the subject of recommendations, but also taking us back to the beginning when we were talking about this kind of oral storytelling aspect to ghost stories that gets taken up into the literature of the Victorian period, one thing I was thinking about was how famous Dickens's performances or readings of A Christmas Carol were, that they were like these spiritual experiences for people to go see him do this, almost like a secular sermon or something. And so I was thinking to myself, since that was kind of the way for people to experience it when he was alive, how, Sherry, would you suggest we experience it through audiobooks today? What are some of the best audiobooks out there of A Christmas Carol?
Well, there's some really great ones that are patterned on that performance technique of Dickens in his public reading. Most people today probably don't realize that he was also an actor. He ran an amateur theatrical company that performed for charity. He almost became a professional actor before he became a writer. And like you say, he gave tremendously popular public readings of his fiction, and his annual readings of Christmas Carol that was his most popular public reading. And if you're interested in experiencing the book that way, the way Victorian readers probably would have experienced it, either hearing it read aloud around the family fire or hearing it read aloud by Dickens himself. One really interesting audio performance to take a look at is the recording by Shakespearean actor Patrick Stewart, who's probably best known as Captain Picard on Star Trek The Next Generation and from the X-Men films. In the 1990s, he did a really highly acclaimed one-man stage production of A Christmas Carol, in which he acted out all of the characters in the style of Dickens' stage performances. And that production won the New York Drama Critics Award when he took it to Broadway, and they later did an audio recording of it that was nominated for a Grammy Award, and that's not available from most providers of audio books, and I think that's maybe the very best reading. It is abridged. It's cut to about an hour and a half performance, but it's excellent. It captures that balance of sentimentality and horror from the original novella. And then there's also, if you want an unabridged reading, you can get a hold of a reading by Dickens' own great-great-grandson, Gerald Dickens, who is also an actor and gives public performances of A Christmas Carol annually. And he has recorded a whole series of audiobook readings of Dickens novels that are outstanding. Christmas Carol and Oliver Twist are two of the best, and those are unabridged. And then finally, I'd also recommend, there's a really good one adaptation of Christmas Carol read by Tim Curry of Rocky Horror Picture Show fame who makes a spectacular Scrooge. He even starred as Scrooge in the Broadway musical version of Christmas Carol that was written by Alan Menken, the guy who wrote a lot of the music for Disney musicals. So he's played that role before. And that one is also available as an audiobook. So if you want to experience the way that Victorians initially would have experienced those novels, maybe check out some audio recordings.
Well, I guess that's a pretty good place for us to just go ahead and end this special episode. So first of all, just want to say thank you to our guest, Sherry, for a wonderful and enlightening discussion on Charles Dickens and the Christmas Ghost Story. And just a reminder, our next episode is going to be a wonderful interview with the fantastic Ruth Franklin, author of the new Shirley Jackson biography. So catch that in 2 weeks. Thanks for listening. This is the No Fear Podcast. You can find us online at Twitter and Instagram at NoFearCast. That's KNOW Fearcast. Or our website, nofearcast.com. If you want to contact us, send an email to nofearcast@gmail.com. Download us through iTunes, Stitcher, or anywhere else podcasts are found. If you like what you hear, leave us a 5-star review on iTunes, or you can support us on Patreon. Supporters get exclusive access to many episodes released on the weeks in between our normal schedule. Even a little bit makes a big difference. The No Fear Cast. We know what scares you. This is a personal project and not related to any academic institution.